This is the third in a series of videos on using life history and oral history to research media influence. And in previous videos, I've talked about the origins of life history and oral history and sociology. I've talked about how those methods have been applied in published media research. And here I want to be talking about the kinds of research that some of my students have done in the past very effectively using life histories. And finally, I want to be talking about how you can use your own life history to brainstorm a topic in media research. And I'm also going to be pointing you towards some resources that give examples of how that works. So I guess there are a couple of ways. We've been through a few reasons why life history and oral history is a really useful method in doing media research and in understanding the social impact of the media. And here we're kind of flipping things around a little bit, and we're talking about how life history and oral history, but particularly life history, can be used to pick a topic in media research, and how quite often for students reflecting on their own, I guess I'm going to call them media biographies, the stories of their lives where they chart how they've used media over the course of their lives, can be used to identify research topics that can relate to important bodies of existing scholarly literature in media research. So I'm going to be talking about one of those areas and then giving you some tips on how you can start to use this method to do some interesting work. So first, I guess over the years, a feature of my career, I've been teaching since 1990, and increasingly, as my career has progressed, um, I would say, particularly in the last 15 years or so, most of the people I've been teaching have been young undergraduate women. And very often their research, not exclusively, but quite often, they've been very interested in how media has played a part in identifying how they make sense of their gender. And I do recall that in the late 1990s, I had a lot of students who did really excellent work on the role that that magazines aimed at teenage girls had played in kind of in engaging them with discourses about what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a young woman, um, and what it was appropriate to do, what it was appropriate to think, how it was appropriate to behave, and all of those sorts of things. And then quite often these projects would move out to analyze the mixed messages that many of our cultures send out about what it means to be a woman, how a woman should behave, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these projects very often centered on magazines that girls were reading, and this is an example of that. 17 magazine, which is an interesting magazine because it was founded by Triangle Press, owned by Walter Annenberg during the Second World War. And interesting fun fact for you: um, Annenberg was operating under rationing conditions, whereby publishers in the 1940s in America had limited paper supply. So Annenberg had to figure out how to profit and make the most profit from the limited paper reserves that he had. And his idea was to develop a magazine aimed at teenage girls, 17 magazine, and it's still around today. So that's kind of an interesting political economy fact for you. But anyway, one of the common themes that many of my women students have talked about, and they were able to kind of reflect back on these magazines with a few years of distance, And quite often, I recall students getting quite angry at recalling their experiences of reading these magazines in their teenage years, particularly around the way that it sent out all kinds of mixed messages about what to do, what not to do, all of these sorts of things, and quite often women would talk about feeling quite confused by these magazines. And that was really notable because it connected up with some of the research that had actually been done about this. Because while women were doing this research, um, one of the things that they discovered was that feminist media researchers had been writing about precisely this since the 1970s. And they'd been writing about the way that these sorts of magazines that were ostensibly supposed to just be a piece of light entertainment, something that girls read to take their mind off more serious things, were actually really effective agents in provoking anxiety amongst these girls, because the stories are always about problems, right? So I can't find a boyfriend, and of course they were heteronormative. It was always, I can't find a boyfriend, not I can't find a girlfriend, and then I've got a boyfriend. How do I keep him? Or I've got a boyfriend, but you know, um, I don't want a. Is he the right kind of boyfriend? Should I be marrying him? Is he gonna be able to provide for me? Is he the right type of boy? Um, so the point that I'm trying to make is that in sitting down and writing their stories of their engagement with, in this example, publications that were directed at them at the various stages of their lives, quite often women audiences, women students, were able to identify research projects, in this case on the way that they're gradually introduced to ideas about gender through entertainment media. But they were able to identify a research topic that through writing their life stories, that they could then relate quite easily to an existing body of scholarship as a way of developing the method. So the upshot then is that one of the things that you can do, when if you're trying to figure out, why do I care about media, what kind of project can I do, is to write your own media biography. Go back to childhood. What's the first media you remember using? What's the kind of media that you really got into? Why did you get into them? Is there any way in which you could see, looking back, see these media as actually playing an important part in forming your view of the world or forming your view of yourself? And I've actually written my own. This is something that I did for a project a while back. So there's the link to this project here. But a few years ago, I was writing a book on young people and media, and I tried to kind of give an example of how you could use an autoethnography, or and particularly, of course, there are close connections between autoethnography, life history, oral history. But I sat down and kind of wrote my own, I guess, life history based on the media that I'd encountered. And one of the things that I noticed when I did that, and I started off with talking about the comics that I remember reading, from the age of about 6 or 7. And in that time, and this was back in England, and at that time, comic books were very much kind of action adventure type of things. The sorts of comic books that boys read were featured stories about basically war and sport. Basically, that was it. And one of the things I noticed when I started thinking about these stories was that the underlying theme of these stories was quite often about social class. It's kind of strange when I thought about it. A lot of these stories were not just about conflicts in war, but conflicts between people who were on the same side or in sport. And quite often the comics I read were stories about people who were incredibly talented but working class, and about the struggles that they faced, either in warfare or in professional sport, where people of a different social class were trying to oppress them because of the class they were in. And it's kind of odd to me because I do remember as a child sort of just being very conscious of the idea that, oh, class is something that matters in my society, that where you're born, the class position that you're born into, that really has an effect on what you can do with your life. That really has an effect on how other people look at you. So I was just very aware as a child that, everyone isn't born equal. Now, there are other things that I could talk about kind of from my own sort of childhood media experiences, representations of race, racist representations of race, highly gendered representations. But I suppose kind of one of the things that's interesting about this was that as around the class thing, as I grew up and as I've gradually went to university, I found out that social class is actually something that interested historians, and then later, when I was doing my PhD, media researchers as well. So I was actually able to connect to the theory through actually my experiences and reflecting on my experiences as media users. So one of the things that I want you to do then, one of the things you can do, one of the things that I want you to do right now is I want you to go off and write your media life history. I want you to write down the history of your life as it's related to media. What's the media you've consumed over time, and what have you really been passionate about, and in what ways can you relate these passions to social themes? Of course, elsewhere I've also lectured about ideology and power. And one of the things that I realized when I wrote my biography was that questions of ideology, questions of the way that the media represented you with basically political stories about how the world works. So I was introduced very early to the idea that social class is a thing, and you're always going to struggle because you're a working class person. And that's kind of an ideological position. That's a position that introduces you to the idea that you live in a world that's characterized by power relations. And those power relations will have an effect on your world. And then, of course, as I later went to university, I discovered there's a whole kind of ways of theorizing that around writing on ideology. And I really took to the work of Stuart Hall in that regard, because it kind of spoke to my experience. It talked about things that I'd experienced, and I would read Stuart Hall and I'd go, yeah, that's right. I remember feeling that way. So this is just a little tip and a little exercise that I want you to do. Write about also ethnographies. I've given you a link to my example as a kind of as a template that you might want to use, and just have a go at doing that and think about how useful that is. So again, what we're doing is we're introducing that notion of life history that we've talked about in earlier videos, and we're using it now to work through our own life histories as a way of identifying a research project that we'd find engaging and interesting. So I'll see you in class.